Hello, and welcome to Core Skills for Humans, Volume 1, A Bit About Brains. I am your host, Christine Wood. Humans are really interesting, and while many individual characteristics make us different and unique, many aspects of how our brains and bodies work are the same. We're going to take some time to look at the science of humans, a little neuroscience and physiology, and how that shows up in our everyday behaviors and can be helpful to us as leaders. We'll focus on common threads. We're not saying that every brain works identically. Neurodiversity is real, but there are definitely common principles that are very helpful to understand as we discuss the ins and outs of interacting with other humans. If we look at a really brief history of humans, we see that over, say, the last 10,000 years, our environment on Earth has changed rapidly around us. Where we live, what we eat, with whom and how we interact, the activities of daily life all look very different than they did for our ancestors. Sometimes very different from even just 1 or 2 generations ago, not to mention hundreds of generations ago. What has not changed much is how our brains and bodies work. The evolution of technology is far faster than the evolution of the human species. How our brains and bodies function, how we react to threats, and our fundamental human needs are basically the same. First, let me introduce you to a useful model of human brains, focusing on 2 parts with 2 different jobs: the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is located here in the front of your brain and is thought to be responsible for complex cognitive behavior. Things like decision-making, moderating social behavior, and aspects of speech and language. The amygdala, on the other hand, is located deep down in the middle of your brain and is the source of quick decision-making and emotional responses. Sometimes called our reptilian brain, it's home to our fight, flight, or freeze response, for example. Seems like a good division of labor, right? The amygdala is the fast actor. Its job is to get us out of trouble, make split-second decisions. The prefrontal cortex is more contemplative, needs a little more time, and doesn't work well under stress. Think sitting under a tree and having an aha moment. For our purposes, we'll talk about these 2 brain regions in either-or terms. The reality is more complicated, but the model is useful. In this model, our bodies are constantly analyzing our situation or environment to determine which part of our brain we should be using. We're always scanning for threats, because accurately identifying threats has historically kept us alive. Let's talk more about threats. It's said that humans have a general attentional bias toward threat. Evolutionarily, if we mostly noticed all the pretty flowers but missed the poisonous snake, we died, and we didn't pass along our DNA. Our brains still work basically the same way. Remember when we were here talking about how rapidly our environment has changed? Well, let's think about the threats humans might have experienced 10,000 years ago. Lots of them were life-threatening: hunger, fires, predators, things that could kill us. But they weren't terribly frequent. Some of the threats today, however, have changed, and we'll talk about that. But our brains have not really changed. Our threat bias causes us to be constantly subconsciously scanning and preparing for threats, even if we're not aware that it's happening. In today's environment, where there is more stimulation, more to see, more to smell, more to hear, more people to interact with, more speed, just more of everything, there is more for us to scan and react to, which causes us more stress and keeps us in our amygdala rather than our prefrontal cortex. So what? I feel a little bit stressed just talking about it. Deep breath. This kind of stress and our amygdala overload means we are more likely to be reactive and responding emotionally, and less likely to be good at decision-making, moderating social behavior, and using our words. The bottom line is this: if we want to make good decisions and figure things out, we need to use our prefrontal cortex, which means our brain and body have to feel safe and calm. What do we need to feel safe? What a great question! Let's explore that. One theory of human needs that is still useful for us today was first introduced by Abraham Maslow in a scientific journal of psychology in 1943. Maybe you've heard of it, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a pyramid that we build from the bottom up, starting with physiological needs, the needs for our body, which have to be in place first. Then our physical and psychological safety needs, and ultimately our need for belonging and fulfillment. In a later program, we'll talk more about how we, as leaders, can play a role in helping our team members move up the hierarchy of needs, fostering psychological safety, a sense of belonging, and opportunities for people to find fulfillment. When we are interacting with other humans, this is a very helpful pyramid to remember. Let's say you need to have an important conversation with someone about anything. Maybe you want to gather good ideas and get their input, or resolve a challenge. Anything where you want to be using your prefrontal cortex and you want the other person to be using their prefrontal cortex too. In order to use your respective prefrontal cortices, have access to all the good language and decision making, you need to be at least, let's say, midway up the pyramid. Have you both eaten? Are you both physically comfortable? Anyone in the middle of a distracting conflict? So, you've waited until after lunch to have the conversation. Great. What about safety? We'll have a longer conversation about physical and psychological safety, but in the context of this conversation about brains, certainly if we feel unsafe, we're all in our amygdala, right? So let's explore some of what makes humans feel safe or unsafe today. Let's say you're sitting in a meeting and another human in the room says something you really don't agree with. What do you notice about your reaction? Do you get quiet, push back from the table, and sit with your arms crossed? Do you dive into an argument about why the other person is wrong? Do you wish you could find the perfect words in the moment, but you just can't? Those reactions mean your amygdala is working. Let's look at what happened. Another human said something that your brain perceived as a threat. Maybe it didn't threaten your life, but it was a threat. Now, the Christine Wood core skills theory about modern day threats is that they usually fall into one of three categories: turf, worth, and values. For example, turf is what I'm in charge of, including my responsibilities and my space. Worth is what I contribute and why I'm significant. Values are ideas that I believe in strongly. So, this other human in the meeting said something that you perceived as a threat. It threatened your turf, worth, or values maybe. Your amygdala kicked in with a fight or flight response, and part of what's important here is that your prefrontal cortex will not, therefore, be fully functional. That's why you come up with exactly the right thing to say 10 minutes after the meeting when you've cooled off a little bit, but not in the meeting. By the way, that is also why when you're about to give a speech and you're a little bit nervous, you may forget some of what you wanted to say. That nervousness is a stress that engages your amygdala and makes it harder for your prefrontal cortex, remember the language center of the brain, to find the words. So let's rewind to that moment in the meeting. What are we going to do? By now, we see we need to reassure our brains that this isn't really a threatening situation, at least not life-threatening. But how? Just as your brain impacts your body in real measurable ways, elevated heart rate and diverted blood flow, we can use our bodies to impact our brains. The number one best answer in this situation, in my experience, is breathing. Slow, deep breaths Reassure your brain that you're not really in danger, allowing you to think clearly again and use your prefrontal cortex. Using your body or physiology to positively impact your brain. Along with that breath, a little brain to body work can also be helpful. For example, getting curious about your reaction and thinking that through. What emotions am I feeling right now? And why was that emotion ignited? Now, you might not have time in the meeting to go down that path, and we'll talk more about brain-body connections, stress, and getting curious about your emotions in another episode of Core Skills for Humans. If you need to engage your prefrontal cortex a little faster, some positive self-talk can help. Something like, "I'm fine, this is not a threat, just breathe." Brains and bodies are connected, and as such, we can use them together to better practice our core skills and be better humans. So, here's a summary of what we learned today. Some things about being human are pretty consistent, and knowing that can help us better understand ourselves and others. For example, the different roles played by our brain's amygdala and prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex does reasoning, language, big thoughts. The amygdala is in charge of fight or flight and emotional responses. They don't both work at the same time. If you want to keep your cool and make good choices, you're better off using your prefrontal cortex. Our brains and bodies perceive lots of new and different things as threats. Learning and practicing simple techniques can allow us to use the brain-body connection to show up more skillfully. That's it for now. Thanks for joining us at Core Skills for Humans.